This week's Dark Side of the Ring was Saving Face, the Brutus Beefcake story. An appropriate title for a man who had his face destroyed and then rebuilt. He's also a great example of why sometimes it's good to have friends. Because were it not for Hulk Hogan, Beefcake would not have had the career that he did. And now, the two don't even speak. Not the most interesting episode outside of the parasailing accident that almost killed him. That was the darkest part of this Dark Side of the Ring episode. Beefcake, like Earthquake in the first episode of the season, is one of those guys that I grew up watching as a wrestling fan in the Northeast. I grew up on WWE. By the time I got into wrestling, he had just become the Barber and turned babyface. So I had his old LJN figure. I still have his Hasbro figure. I have a replica of the barbershop set for it as well. Shout out to WREcollect.com. They make some cool 3D printed retro stuff. Brutus was a mid-card player, but I would say upper mid-card for a good part of his run there. He was over. I mean, he did get that barber gimmick over, and him, rubbing shoulders with Hogan didn't hurt, but even when he wasn't tagging with Hulk, he was definitely one of the more over baby faces they had in that late 80s period. Hogan and Beefcake against Zeus and the Macho King is an underrated SummerSlam main event. It is still fun to go back and watch that. You got Tony Schiavone and Jesse Ventura on commentary. Tony didn't even know he was calling the show until that day. And Vince McMahon didn't like the job that he did that night. I thought he was really good, but... Anyway, Brian Knobbs was interviewed for this, another disciple of the Hulkster. And he was immediately busting Brutus's balls. He said he wasn't even a good wrestler. Brian Blair was interviewed. He's one of the more sane, mild-mannered, level-headed guys from that era whenever I hear him speak. And he's also been the president of the Cauliflower Alley Club for many years. Did you know that Brutus had a nice ass? Which is how he got the name Beefcake? I can't say that I ever noticed. I never really bothered looking or paying attention, but I suppose that's where the Booty Man came from in WCW. That's the other thing about Ed Leslie. I don't think that there has ever been anybody in the history of wrestling, nobody of note, nobody who is a reasonable star, at a star-like level, that has gone through as many gimmicks and names and transformations as this man. From starting out as one of the Boulder brothers with Hulk Hogan. He had Terry and Eddie Boulder, right? He was Eddie Boulder. He became Dizzy Hogan. To Brutus Beefcake. Then Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Then he was the Run-In Man. That's not what they called him, but that's what he was. I mean, he would run out on TV a few times under a mask. He was wearing a fishing basket around his neck. I have no fucking idea why. This was after his accident. He would run out, he would headbutt the heels, and then he would run away. He even saved Greg Valentine once. We got a Dream Team reunion and didn't even know it. I have no idea what the point of that gimmick was, because a couple of months later they debuted the barbershop. But then in WCW he went through, I mean, it's comical, like how many different names and gimmicks. They called him Brother Brutai. Of course he was with Hogan, and he called him Brother Brut, because if it's Hogan, you gotta have brother in the name, so he was Brother Brutai. That didn't stick. They couldn't call him the Barber anymore. It's kind of like when the Boss Man came in, they tried calling him the Boss, and they got hit with a cease and desist, and then he was the Guardian Angel, and I think they got another cease and desist, and so they had to change him back to Big Bubba. So Brutus couldn't be the Barber anymore, so they started calling him the Clip Master. I know this is going to be a shock to you all, but that went nowhere. So after that, he turned heel. He became the Butcher, and they headlined fucking Starrcade in 1994 with Hulk Hogan against the Butcher. Starrcade was like their WrestleMania. And they put the Butcher in a world title match in the main event against Hogan. I'm sure at Hogan's request. So after the Butcher, he was turned babyface again, this time as the Man with No Name. Now why was he the Man with No Name? Because he had amnesia. I wish I had amnesia, so I didn't remember any of this. So from the Man with No Name, he became the Man with No Face, even though he still very much had a face. Then he joined the Dungeon of Doom as the Zodiac, only to find out months later he was a mole on the inside for Hogan the entire time. He's like Kurt Angle with the Alliance. He was a mole. So then he was back to being a babyface. That's when he became the Booty Man, who was in love with his own ass. And then Hogan rechristened him as Big Brother Booty, because again, you got to have the word brother in there. So he was Big Brother Booty. And then finally, after the NWO formed, we got the Disciple, who played bodyguard for Hogan, which is appropriate, really, because the man owes his career to Hulk Hogan. I will say this. Hogan looked out for his friends. And that may not have always made for great television if you were a fan, but if you were his friend, he took care of you. Even when he went to WCW, a lot of guys got hired off of either being friends with Hogan or a big guy for Hogan. He knew he could beat them and make himself look good, so let's bring in Kamala, and let's bring in John Tenta, and let's bring in all these different people. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was brought in, Ed Leslie was brought in, right? There are a lot of examples of Hogan bringing his people in. Now, after that Disciple run, his career was basically over. I mean, that was in 99 when WCW let him go. Really, his career ended in 93. If we're being perfectly honest here. His career was over in 93 with the Barber gimmick because he didn't do anything of any real value in WCW. He got a paycheck out of it. He played all these different stupid characters. None of them got over. Nobody cared. Beefcake was childhood friends with Hogan. They went to the same high school. And he was hanging around trying to get noticed by Hogan and his friends, which actually makes a lot of sense. It was Hogan's idea to break into the business. Beefcake went along with it. He followed suit. Much like in WCW where Hogan signed and then got his friend a job. That's how Beefcake got his job in WWE. And it was Linda McMahon who was credited with being the one to come up with the Beefcake name. He was not a great worker, which is why they put him with Greg Valentine, and the Dream Team was born. And they had a run as the tag team champions. Their match at WrestleMania 2 against the British Bulldogs was the best match on the entire show. And they sprung the Barber gimmick on him out of nowhere in 87. It was just one day, I guess Vince just came up with the idea. They sprung it on him. He claimed in the episode he wasn't happy about it, and he was throwing furniture backstage one day. He was in a rage, and somebody went to go get Hulk and said, Brutus has lost his mind or whatever, and he says it was Hulk's idea for him to start using the sleeper hold and then cut off part of his opponent's hair. And evidently, that's all Brother Brutai had to hear to convince him that everything was going to be okay. Hulk was able to calm him down. Now, there were a couple of different times where Brutus was allegedly going to win the Intercontinental title, but it did not work out. And this is not anything they mentioned in the episode, but I wanted to mention it here, because I don't know when is the next time I'll have the chance to even talk about this. But I want to bring this up because, according to Beefcake, now he has told multiple versions of this story, which is one of the reasons why I find him to be so unreliable. But he claims that he was supposed to beat the Honky Tonk Man for the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam in 88. They worked together at WrestleMania that year. He did not win the belt there. The match had already been announced for SummerSlam. It was going to be him and Honky again. This time he was going to win the title at Madison Square Garden. Until that damn Ultimate Warrior, he threw a fit and he threatened to quit unless he got the match and he won the title. And so plans changed. Now I want you to think about this. The Ultimate Warrior, in 1988, as much of a fucking whack job as he was, in 1988, he was basically a nobody. Okay, he had no political stroke, he had no power. Brutus was best friends with the top star in the company, at least. Do you really think if the Ultimate Warrior threw a fit and threatened to walk out if they didn't put the belt on him, that they would have just given him what he wanted? On this one, I find the Honky Tonk Man to be the more credible party. He claims the plan was always for the Warrior to be the one to beat him at SummerSlam, and they knew about it 6 months beforehand. The plan was always for Brutus to be announced as the opponent, and then they would shoot the angle, which they did, on TV with Ron Bass, where Bass would split him open. I think it was with the spur of his boot. And I remember the angle as a kid, they censored it. They put like a giant X over Beefcake's face as he was being attacked and he was bleeding. Now, they taped that angle almost a month before the pay-per-view. It didn't air until the week before SummerSlam, but they taped it like a month in advance. So he was storyline injured and he was taken out of the match. Then at SummerSlam, Honky Tonk Man comes to the ring and he says, "Send somebody out here." And when they hit the Warriors' music, the place went ballistic. A 15-month reign as the Intercontinental Champion ended in 30 seconds, and a star was born. That's how you make a new star. Now, if Beefcake had won the title that night and he had cut Honky's hair, they would have gone crazy for that too. Again, he was super over at the time. I'm not saying he wasn't. But at no point do I believe that Brutus the Barber Beefcake was supposed to win the Intercontinental title at SummerSlam in 1988. Considering he hung out with Hogan for so long, I could see why he's able to spin these tales so effortlessly. Now, he did hand Mr. Perfect his first loss at WrestleMania 6. 3 weeks later, Perfect won a tournament to become the Intercontinental Champion because after the Warrior beat Hogan, Jack Tunney said you can't have both belts, so they vacated the IC. Perfect won it. And then at SummerSlam that year, I do believe that Beefcake would have won the belt from him. That I believe. But the month before is when he had his accident. And after that, they had a scramble to figure out a plan B. They ended up going with Kerry Von Erich. He was not their first choice. They were going to put the title on the British Bulldog. The Bulldogs had left in '88. Davey was going to come back to the company. He was going to beat Mr. Perfect. But they couldn't get his visa paperwork done in time. Otherwise, it would have been him winning the title that night and not Kerry. But the most interesting part of the whole thing, of this whole episode, is the accident. It was July 4th, 1990. Brutus said he had one day off, and he was going to live it up, and he was going to party like there's no tomorrow. And this was really the peak of his career. You're talking about 1990, the summer of 90, the Barber gimmick is working. Again, I think he was going to win the title that year, and he was never the same after this. They had Beefcake go back to the lake house where it happened. So you actually, in the episode, see him back at the scene of the crime. And it was great that they had Brian Blair on for this because Brian Blair was there, so he could speak to what happened that day. His friend had a ski boat, and he would take people parasailing. Beefcake's friend. Blair comes over with some friends, and they wanted to parasail. Now, Blair didn't want to do it himself because it didn't look safe to him, but his friend Tracy really wanted to do it. So she goes up, and she's coming back in so fast, 35 miles an hour, I believe it was. And Beefcake had his back turned. She's coming straight for his head. So she pulls her knees up to try to avoid him, but as soon as he turns, it's like, and they have the reenactment here, and it pretty much worked this exact way. Almost at the moment that Brutus is turning his head back around, she catches him right in the face, coming in at 35 miles an hour with her knees at full force, shatters every bone in his face. His face basically just collapsed. He does a flip. Now, he's still conscious, but he doesn't really know how gravely injured he really is until he realizes that he can't see. His vision is gone, and he's having trouble breathing. Blair said he pulled him out of the water. His upper jaw was sitting on top of his lower jaw. Because think about it. If you break every bone in your face, what is there to hold up your face? Right? Everything just sags. It just falls. Someone had to stick their hand in his mouth to pry it open so that he could breathe. He can't speak. All he can do, like there's gurgling noises coming out of his throat. His nasal cavity was completely crushed. He went totally blind in both eyes because the optic nerve had been damaged. That took 7 hours of surgery alone just to restore his vision. They had to sew his eyelids shut so he wouldn't blink or do something to fuck it all up. They put him in a medically induced coma for a few days. They showed the x-ray of what his face looked like when they brought him into the hospital, and I don't know what I was looking at, but it didn't look good. I know that. I know a human skull is not supposed to look the way that it did in that x-ray. They interviewed his surgeon. They actually found the man who operated on him, the man who saved his life. He got called in that day. They told him it's Brutus Beefcake. I can just imagine the people at the hospital. We've got Brutus the Barber Beefcake here at the hospital. He says he had no idea who that was. His son told him, hey, that's Hulk Hogan's partner. I fucking died. Oh, the story of this man's life. Who is this guy? He's Hulk Hogan's friend. They're going to put that on the man's tombstone. Brutus is in an ungodly amount of pain. He just wants to die. I would too if I were in that situation. My God, I mean, it's just, I can't imagine. They had to basically rebuild this man's face. 16 hours in total is what it took to put him back together again. Beefcake says they cut him ear to ear. They peeled his face down and his scalp back. The doctor said the important thing was getting the eye sockets where they needed to be. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. It took 8 titanium plates, 32 screws, over 100 feet of steel wire to reconstruct his face. If that woman's knee would have been a quarter of an inch lower and would have connected dead on with his nose, he'd be dead right now. The fact that he even got his vision back is a miracle. Now, Beefcake's wife, Missy, was interviewed for this episode as well and shared the story that Brutus told this same story in his book. I talked about this once. And given the source, you have to take this with a grain of salt because it just sounds too unbelievable to be true. But this whole accident seems too unbelievable to be true. But he really did survive something that would have killed most people, so who knows. But one day, Hulk Hogan is visiting him in the hospital. And Hulk wants him to get up. You gotta move. You gotta get moving here. So they're walking in the hallway. When all of a sudden, Beefcake's eyeball falls out of his head, and it was dangling next to his cheek. That was one of the reasons that they had sewn his eyelids shut, to prevent something like that from happening. But again, this is the same man who, after the Ultimate Warrior died, when he was asked in, I don't know what interview it was, but he was asked if steroid use was common back in the 80s and 90s, and he said, no, it wasn't common at all. Yeah. And I'm doing a live sound-off as part of the Super Bowl halftime show next year. I can't wait. So he didn't know if he would ever wrestle again. Hogan got him parts in some B movies. They showed clips. Missy Hyatt was interviewed. She says Brutus would carry Hogan's drugs for him so it wouldn't come back on Hulk. Beefcake even admitted he would carry Hulk's gimmicks for him. That's what he called them. He didn't say drugs. I carried Hulk's gimmicks and his money for him. Probably in his fanny pack. Because Hulk trusted him. You know, he treated this guy like a gopher, but Hulk trusted him. One historically significant event that came out of all this was the barbershop incident with Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, where Marty dove through the window trying to escape. If Beefcake does not have his accident, there is no barbershop. So Shawn probably would have turned on Marty on the Brother Love show or something. Hogan signs with WCW. He gets Brutus a job there. Eric Bischoff is interviewed. He refers to Brutus as the Hulk Hogan tax. That was funny. I'll give him that. That was good. We go from the doctor saying, oh, it's Hulk Hogan's friend, and now he is being referred to as the Hulk Hogan tax. And then Bischoff says the quiet part out loud, which is that Hogan never demanded anything, but they had an understanding that if he wanted something bad enough, Eric had to pay for it. Basically, he had Eric by the balls. It's why I love the way that Eric tells the Starrcade 97 story when he defends Hulk. Eric insists that Hogan, he never used his creative control card in WCW. Yeah, he had it available to him. It was in his contract, but no, at no point during his run in WCW did he actually pull the creative control clause. Sure, he may never have legally exercised it, but if you don't think that Hogan did not use his creative control card to get what he wanted out of Bischoff, like a sword of Damocles above his head, you're being very naive. It's like a mob boss who tells you to do something without actually telling you to do it. You just know it has to be done. I don't blame Brutus for that. Hulk was looking out for his boy. You know, no different than Sting going to bat for Lex Luger with Bischoff and getting him a job after Lex left WWE. Or all the Clique guys looking out for one another. It's not like nepotism or favoritism is exclusively a Hulk Hogan thing. It was just very prevalent with Ed Leslie. So Brutus ends up falling on tough times after WCW lets him go. And he claimed he had a money manager that ripped him off and fled to Barbados and took all of his money. He was a millionaire one day and he was selling his house the next. And his now ex-wife moved back to Boston to be closer to her family, and so Brutus moved to Boston just to be closer to his daughter. And he absolutely buried Boston here in this episode. He said, oh, I had to live there for 12 years in that cold, miserable place. He was working as a toll collector for the Transit Authority. I remember this story very well. Now, he claimed he used to take at the time BC powder, which is an aspirin substitute. And one day, it fell out of he had it in a little packet. And it fell out of his pocket on the floor when he was leaving the station. He was leaving his shift one day. And so another toll collector ends up picking it up, doesn't know what it is, opens the packet, and when they noticed that it was this white powder, they panicked, thinking that it was anthrax. This was at a time where there were lots of anthrax scares and mail rooms and places. I remember all the news stories. They were being shut down. There's a white powdery substance, and they think it's, anthrax was it was a terrorist agent. This was at a time after 9/11. Everybody was panicked about everything. The only thing is, it wasn't anthrax. And it wasn't aspirin powder. No matter how hard he wants you to believe that it was not aspirin powder. It was cocaine. Greg Valentine even said, "You want the truth or you want me to lie?" And the producer said the truth. He said it was cocaine. And that shut the entire train station down for 90 minutes in the middle of the afternoon while they sent hazmat teams in to confirm that it wasn't a terrorist attack. So here is Brutus the Barber Beefcake, one-time wrestling star on national television, Hulk Hogan's friend, making $25,000 a year collecting subway fares with a tax lien against him of $57,000 by the IRS, and having an entire train station shut down over a packet of cocaine, which he admitted to at the time that it was cocaine, and he checked himself into rehab. Now, in the episode, he and his wife claimed it was not cocaine, it was BC powder. Even the producer doesn't buy her bullshit and says, "You can understand why people would have a hard time believing that, right?" And she says, "Oh, yeah, but then why wasn't he arrested?" Okay, well then why did he go to rehab? Is that how things work in the legal system up there in Boston? They send you to rehab for aspirin that falls out of your pocket? His wife, Missy, again, she's one of the talking heads in the episode, and I will say this. They seem to really be in love with each other. And I hope that their relationship is as loving and genuine as it seems in the episode. She first saw Brutus on television in the 80s. Instantly fell in love with him. She was a fan. One day got backstage at one of the shows, might have been in Boston, funny enough, and told Brutus that she loved him. Right? Sounds like a crazed fan who broke free and runs up to the wrestler and says, "I love you, I love you." Years later, she was doing online dating, and somebody, I don't remember how it came up. It came up that the guy she was talking to knew where Brutus lived, and he was like, "Oh yeah, he lives in whatever the name of the town was." And she was like, "What?" And she ends up getting his number and texts Brutus and says, "Look, I've always had this fantasy of sleeping with you, and I just wanted to know if that would be possible." If only it were that easy. But evidently it was just that easy, and Brutus, of course, immediately, he must have been doing nothing that particular day. He picked up the phone, called her, and they hooked up. And she says, "I only wanted it to be a one-and-done thing, but we ended up falling in love." That's quite the love story. She definitely comes across as the alpha female in that household. She said that we've weeded out all the assholes and all the bad influences in Brutus's life. It's like, she made it sound like, "I've made sure he's no longer friends with this person and that person and that person," right? She's taken command. Greg Valentine hates her guts. I mean, he did a shoot interview last year. I don't think I have heard the C word used as many times in one interview as Valentine did in a 3-minute span to describe Missy Beefcake. He and his wife, both, apparently they don't like her at all. Hulk Hogan apparently doesn't care for her because she's the reason why Hogan and Beefcake no longer speak. Hogan has said he did not have an issue with Brutus, only his wife, but he has never said what the issue is. Now, I know they had a falling out some years ago. Then they reconciled. Hogan even inducted Brutus into the Hall of Fame in 2019. Brutus claims that that was the last time he spoke or saw Hulk. Hulk has not spoken a word to him since that Hall of Fame ceremony. It's a very weird situation. I know Beefcake got very upset years ago during Hogan's Gawker trial when, in his testimony, Hogan brought up Beefcake's wife. I think it was in the context of saying, "I have no friends, and Brutus used to be my friend, but we don't speak anymore because Hulk and Missy, they don't get along." So Brutus got upset about that. I remember at the time it was a whole big thing. He posted on his Facebook page. He didn't know why Hogan would mention his wife's name during his trial, and he threatened to reveal the real truth if he did it again. Like, shit's about to go down, and the real truth is going to come out. I have no idea what he meant by that. I am sure there are a lot of skeletons in that closet. They can keep them in there as far as I'm concerned. You know, sometimes friends fight. They say things that they don't really mean. They say things that they live to regret. I think it's sad that they don't talk anymore, considering how long they were friends for. But none of these people come across great here, so I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. But I do want to share one of my favorite Beefcake stories. It's actually from Ric Flair's book. Flair wrestled Eddie Guerrero on Nitro one night. I think it was back in '96. And this was at a time that Flair was working a program with Hogan. Flair goes backstage after the match. Beefcake walks up to him and says, "I don't think the big guy is going to be happy about you selling that much for Eddie. You've got to look at the big picture, Rick. Basically, Eddie's a small guy, and you're giving him too much, and Hulk thinks that you're going to kill whatever credibility you have by selling for him and then working with Hulk." Flair was so offended by how stupid Beefcake was that he thought he could tell Ric Flair anything about pro wrestling. Now that's funny.